This was the first lengthy passage I ever learned. So it has great sentimental meaning to me. When I look at this chapter of the Bible, not only do I learn something from it and can gain the insight of it, reminds me of my grandmother. So it brings fond memories to my mind. It brings fond memories of my heart. I loved my grandmother. She was growing up. I had only one set of grandparents. My father's parents passed away. My grandmother passed away before I was born, and my grandfather passed away when I was only a few months old. So I only knew one set of grandparents growing up. So she was very special to me. And so this makes me feel good when I look at this passage and remember it. But I'll start off with reading the chapter, and then before we get into kind of dissecting it, I'd like to look at the author. I believe for us to really understand the passage, I think we kind of need to understand the author, to understand it better. So what I like to do is read through it, then we'll kind of look at in just a real broad sense David's life, and kind of from birth to death, and just kind of his timeline. Then we'll see if we can break this down and learn a few things. It starts off, Psalms 23. The Lord is my shepherd. There is nothing I lack. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. He leads me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. Now, when I learned it, I learned the New King James Version, so a lot of thous and thou shalt, and so, this is a little different version. This is the Holman Bible.
Is it New English?
Let's see, what is this? Holman Christian Standard Bible.
It's not mine.
It's a different, but it's like I said, it's not the New King James Version. It's not the Message. There's different renditions you can get, but they all speak. We can all learn the same lessons from them. The words may have changed a little bit, but we all get the same lessons from them. But before we get into this, I'd like to look at the life of David first, so we can kind of see the timeline of his life, remember some of the things, and maybe see where this passage fits in his life, and then we'll see if we can break this down and learn a few things. So starting off, when David is born, Saul is king. And then Samuel anoints, later on down the line of David's life, Samuel comes and anoints David, and Saul brings him on an as-needed basis to provide relief through music. If you remember, David played the harp. He was a musician. He brought peace to the king. Whenever he was troubled and stressed, he would bring David in and say, play the harp for me, make him feel good. So David was anointed from a very young age and was immediately brought into the king's court and provide some relief to the king. Then, if you'll remember, David gets a little older and he defeats Goliath. If you'll remember that story, David's the younger brother. His father sends him out to his brothers, says, hey, I want you to take some food and some wine, take some provisions to your brothers. Go check on them. And when he goes and does that, he sees this huge Goliath giant ridiculing the soldiers there. And David's just young and brash enough that he doesn't see danger, so he steps up to the place and says, I got something for you. If you remember that whole story, David ends up taking down Goliath, doing something that guys twice his age and twice his size are fearful to do. David has no fear because he believes in God. He trusts the God that God's going to defend him. David takes down Goliath. And we know the story, the lessons we can learn from that. And then when later on, we learn about his best friend Jonathan. So obviously you can see I may relate to that a little bit. It says, Jonathan, who is much older, becomes very close friends with David. And if you remember, Jonathan is Saul's son. So then David becomes an armor bearer to Saul. He's the one carrying the armor around for King Saul whenever he goes into battle. Then Saul banishes David from his court. He gets mad at him, but he makes him commander over 1,000 men, possibly at the age of 25. That's what I read. Then I read, Saul then gives his daughter Michal, hope I read that right, to David as his wife, David's first wife of many, presumably as a snare, trying to entrap David, as some people think, but she loves David, so it doesn't quite work out for Saul as well as he hopes. And then Jonathan and Michal warns David that Saul wants to kill him, and David has to flee to Samuel at Ramah. Then later on, Michal stays behind with Saul, the king, and an evil spirit causes Saul to chase after David to Ramah. So now we start the whole thing of now Saul's starting to chase David. Then David and Jonathan make a covenant at Ramah, makes a promise, a pact. Then David flees to Nob and is helped by Ahimelech, who gives David consecrated bread and Goliath's sword. So now he gets that sword where he defeated Goliath. David then flees to Achish, king of the Philistines, in the city of Gath, and feigns madness for protection. If you'll remember that, he foams at the mouth, pretends to go crazy to protect himself. Then David hides at the cave of Adullam, hope I said that right, where his father's household joins him. So David's dad and his household comes and joins him to be with him. Then David takes his parents to Mizpah of Moab to be left with that king for protection. Then Doeg, I hope I said that right, I hope I wrote that right, at Saul's command, kills Ahimelech, 85 priests, and everyone at Nob that helped David. Abner, son of the priest, flees to David with the ephod. Then David liberates Keilah from the Philistines, and Saul heads there with his forces to kill David. David then uses the ephod to learn that the people of Keilah will betray him to Saul, and he flees again. He's on the run again. Jonathan visits with David at Ziph and covenants with him again, makes another promise with him. The Ziphites betray David, but God hides him from Saul in the desert of Ziph. As you can see, David constantly on the run here. People are constantly pursuing him. Saul pursues David at En-Gedi, where he cuts the corner of Saul's robe in the cave near the crags of wild goats, is what I read. David comes out of the cave to tell Saul what he has done, and Saul goes home. You remember that story which always fascinates me. How sharp of a knife did David have that he can cut the corner of that robe and Saul never know? That just amazes me, but we remember that story. David then meets Nabal and Abigail at Carmel. Nabal expects payment for his flocks, something to do with that, and Nabal refuses David's offer. David threatens to kill Nabal, but Abigail intercedes. David ends up marrying Ahinoam. All right, Mr. Lloyd, how do you pronounce that? Ahinoam, Ahinoam. There you go. Jezreel. I'm a boy from Jolton, all right? You got to help me a little here. Of Jezreel. And then he marries Abigail, where Nabal dies. Y'all should have heard me try to learn Spanish. While David is away from Saul, Saul gives Michal, his first wife, to Paltiel and Galim. David is betrayed by the Ziphites for a second time, meets Saul with his forces at Hakilah. David spares Saul's life again And Saul repents. Starting to see a pattern here. David's running away. Saul tries to go after him. David has a chance, can kill Saul. Spares his life. He just keeps coming back. David flees to Gath for a second time with 600 men and their families. Saul finally stops his pursuit of David. Took him a while. David lives with Achish in Gath for a short time, asked to move to Ziklag with his men. Here he serves the Philistines for a year, and Achish defends David against his officers. Then we get into Samuel dies, and Saul calls up his spirit. Samuel's spirit prophesies that Saul will die the next day. Saul dies with his son at the battle with the Philistines. The Philistines release David. This is where it's thought that David wrote the 23rd Psalm. The Amalekites raise Ziklag and take the wives of David's men. David and 400 of his men recapture the women, and he shares the plunder with the elders of Judah and the 200 men that could not go. Then David, with his allies, assumes control of Judah and becomes king, where he reigns for 7.5 years. David then marries Micah, Haggith, Abital, and Iglah. Multiple wives. Ishbosheth liberates the remainder of the western territory from the Philistines and is declared king over Israel. Abner, Ishbosheth's general, kills Saul at Gibeon, where he starts war with David. Ishbosheth accuses Abner of infidelity with Saul's concubine. Abner threatens Ishbosheth and covenants with David. Ishbosheth returns Michal to David, and David's general Joab murders Abner at Hebron. Did you follow that? But David gets his first wife back. David conquers Jerusalem, rebuilds it, and moves there from Hebron. Ishbosheth is murdered, and David is anointed king over all of Israel. This starts David's 33-year reign over Jerusalem. David's total kingship lasts 40 years. Ark is returned to Jerusalem to a tent, but the tabernacle remains in Gibeon. David wants to build a temple for the ark, but God sends Nathan to David with a covenant promising a perpetual throne to his offspring. David's sons become royal advisors at the thought to be age of 14 to 18. This distorts their sense of self-importance. Can you imagine that? Becoming advisors to the king at age 14? I don't want to take any kind of advice from, at 14 years old, I'm glad I didn't advise anybody. Ammon and Syria are conquered by Joab and Abishai after David's ambassadors are humiliated by the young king of Ammon. David indulges his children, allows his generals to run their own war, and he falls prey to the temptations of having it all. This is where he sleeps with Bathsheba, and Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, dies in battle. So we remember that story where David he stayed home from war. It's the first time ever. He didn't go to war with his men. He stays at home. He's up there on the rooftops, and he sees Bathsheba bathing on the roof. And if it was the summertime, I kind of know why, because back then they didn't have water heaters. So if you wanted a hot water, you could put your bath on the roof when it was blazing hot. And I can tell you from someone who's been on roofs, it gets hot. You can get you a hot tub up there quick. So she's up there having her a nice hot bath. David's king. He's up, so he sees down. The devil enters his heart. He lusts after her, and then he creates that sin. And we know the story and how that plays out. Solomon is born and future heir to the throne. David returns his attention to the throne and conquers Rabba Ammon. So he basically goes back to focusing on his kingship and fighting his wars again. He doesn't stay at home anymore. Ammon then rapes his half-sister Tamar, who is Absalom's sister. Then Absalom murders Ammon and is banished from David's presence for 3 years. So we remember that story. Absalom pleads for and his return to Jerusalem via Joab's intercession and his conniving use of women of Tekoa. Absalom is banished from the king's presence for 2 more years. Absalom begs and coerces Joab to intercede again to the king, thus starting his 4-year plot against David. So we remember that David's son now is going to start chasing after David, just like Saul did. Absalom revolts and steals the hearts of the people from David. Then he sleeps with David's concubines, as Abner had done with Saul's. And then Absalom's heir is caught in a tree while riding a mule, and Joab kills him against David's orders. David mourns his death. So David starts, even though he was being chased by his own son, he's still his son. So he still mourns his son's death. Then David battles with the Philistines. He is almost killed by a giant, and David is asked to stay at home for his safety, and 4 giants are killed by his men. So I guess at this point, David is getting old enough in his age that they decide it's best that he just stay at home. David purchases the threshing floor of Araunah, and he begins the preparations to construct the new temple around the altar. Then David charges Solomon and the princes with the task of construction of the temple. And David's health begins to fail him, and Bathsheba convinces him to appoint Solomon as king. And then David privately instructs Solomon to walk with God. And finally, David dies of natural causes at 70 to 75 years old, and he is buried in Jerusalem. Now, that is a real big overview of David's life. And there's a lot to it, but the theme I see there is someone's always chasing him. Someone's always chasing him, always coming after him, trying to kill him. But he never tries to attack them back. He's always turning the other cheek. He's always forgiving them, saying, okay, I forgive you. Let's move on. I think that's something we can learn from that, right? So now we get into the 23rd Psalm. And it's this psalm here, it's called the Good Shepherd. Now, I've never owned sheep. My dad never owned sheep. He owned cattle. And my father-in-law, a lot of y'all know my father-in-law, he owns goats and donkeys and 1 mule and a horse and chickens. And at one point, he owned a llama. And he's had wild geese and ducks and had all kinds of animals. So I've been around livestock my whole life. So I know what it's like to care for an animal, to take care of the animal. Don't know what it's like about a sheep. I've heard they're some of the worst smelling animals out there, which that's hard for me to understand because I know a goat can smell pretty bad. but I've heard that sheep smell pretty bad, but the principle's the same. It's an animal, right? So to take care of an animal, they're livestock like this, they're defenseless, right? They have no way of protecting themselves. They are completely reliant on their shepherd, their person that is going to watch after them, is going to protect them, is going to herd them in the direction they need to go. And there's a lot of implications we can get from this. There's some correlations we can get from it, and we're going to look at a couple tonight. One's going to be how David wrote this thinking he's the shepherd and his people is the sheep, and he also can look at it as he's writing this as God is the shepherd and he's the sheep. And of course, we can look at it as God is our shepherd and we are the sheep. So let's dive into this. So I wrote 23rd Psalm is thought to be the Psalm of trust. All right, the entire chapter expounds on the theme that David has no fear because the Lord is the shepherd. So if you remember, when you're a baby, when you're young, you think your parents can do no wrong. You think your parents can do anything. You think you have no fear, no anxiety, no stress, because you know that your parents are going to protect you. You feel like you're invincible because your parents are going to be right there. I remember when I was young, I was a lot more brash than I am now because I thought, nobody can touch me. My dad is so big, nobody can touch me. And so you get older, and of course you start seeing a little bit more of the dangers, and you don't become as brash as you used to be. You start to be a little bit more timid. My dad used to tell me that he served in the military for a couple of years, and he said when he went to basic training, he went in at, I think it was like age 25. He said it was funny because he'd go in and he would see soldiers 18, 19 coming in. He said we'd come up to some obstacle, and the drill sergeant would tell us, run straight through it or jump over that. He said the 18 or 19-year-old teenagers wouldn't think twice. They just run and jump. They didn't care about what was below them. They didn't care about what was on the other side. They were just straight following orders. And Dad would say, but see, I was a little bit older. I knew if I fell down that hole, it could hurt. So he said, I was a little bit more timid. I would think about what is below that. He didn't trust the sergeants as much as those 18 and 19-year-old teenage boys did. But that's what we get in this passage is the sheep trust that shepherd implicitly because they know that shepherd is going to protect them no matter what is coming out of those woods. They trust that shepherd, and they'll do whatever that shepherd asks them to do. So this whole passage can be, if it's one word that can describe this passage, is trust. It's relying on that shepherd. So we can look in this, as I was saying a while ago, we got a couple of lenses we can look through to see this chapter. And that is, David's the sheep. He's the king. He's the sheep. You know that during those times, it was thought to be that the king, who was the ruler, well, it's more than they just ruled their people. They were responsible for their people, right? They were responsible for making sure that the people, a good king, would make sure their people were provided for, their people were protected, their people could thrive and could have a good life. And that was a king that did that, who thought about that, was a well-loved king, right? The people trust their king. So you can look at this chapter as king, that David is the king. He loves his people, who are in his eyes the sheep. And then you can also look at it as God is not only David's shepherd, but he's our shepherd too, right? So we know that even at our age now, even though that we may see the dangers in life that we didn't see at 10 years old, we see the dangers that are in the life a little bit more timid, but we also know that we have a God that is our shepherd, that created this world and who sent his son, who has overcome death, who has overcome all of these dangers, and we trust in God, who is our shepherd. We can have peace in knowing that, right? So if you look at John 10:11, I wrote this down, John 10:11 and 10:14, Jesus speaks of himself as the good shepherd. It says, who gave his life for the sheep, and who can say, I know my sheep, and they know me. So if you remember that passage, that Jesus can also be looked at as our shepherd as well, right? It talks about in the Bible, it relates to Jesus being our shepherd and we being his sheep. And if you will see, there's some early paintings of Jesus walking with a sheep on his shoulder, right? We've seen those paintings, and this right here is one of the passages that is referring to, of Jesus is our shepherd. We are his sheep, and we rely on him implicitly. Now, something else to know that in David's time, King David's time, when he was a young boy, he was sent to be the shepherd because he was the youngest of the brothers. And so he got the grunt work of all of them. Now today, the times are a little bit different, right? Sometimes we treat our youngest as the baby, and we don't give them the hard work, and the oldest gets the hard work. But back in this time, the oldest didn't get the hard work. The youngest, the siblings, the youngest of the kids were the ones that had to do the hard work, the manual labor. They got just the grunt work. So David was sent out. His father sent him out to be the shepherd, to take care of the sheep. But if you look at it, you think about back in that time, he didn't have a rifle, he didn't have a shotgun, he didn't have, all he had to defend off the animals was his staff, right? The staff, his rod, maybe a knife. And the predators that go after sheep are lions and bears and coyotes and maybe some bobcats. I'm not sure what animals were there. I know lions and bears were, because the Bible talks about it. Around here, we're used to coyotes and bobcats, and where I can say I've heard the coyotes at nighttime. I've heard them, but I've never come around. I've seen the fox run across a field a time or two, but I have not come up to a coyote. But I have been attacked by a couple of just dogs. There was one time I was a kid, and they had a neighbor and her German shepherds. She had them out, and they were playing. And if you know anything about German shepherds, they're not the most friendliest to who's not the owner, right? So I go over there because I was going to say hi to my friend, and they attacked me. And I'm kicking them, and I'm punching them, trying to get them off of me. And I got bit a couple of times. Finally, I was able to get back home. That's the closest I've come to fighting a wild animal. And that was close enough. And that was just a dog. But David fought off lions and bears. I don't know about you, the closest I've been to a lion or a bear is a zoo or a ride in Disney World. And I'm 5'6" in a prayer, and I can't imagine coming up against a 10-foot tall bear. So think about that. David, at a young age, was fighting off lions and bears with his bare hands. The other place you read about that in the Bible of someone fighting off bears is Samson. Is that right? So just try to think about that for a minute. Just let that sink in. David, at a young age, was killing bears and lions with his bare hands. I don't think I want to mess with David. But he was, at a young age, he was protecting the sheep. And think about how tough David would have been at that time. How strong he would have been able to protect his sheep. So even though that was the grunt work he had to do, he took it very seriously, and he was good at it. And it made him very strong. This also, when I read about this and remember this, I also think about the correlation I make is later in the Bible where Jesus takes on the lowliest of jobs for us, right? Jesus takes on, he loves us so much. If you remember the story of one time, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, which is one of the lowliest jobs you can do. He humbles himself to show his love to his disciples, and God still does that today. He sent his only son, didn't even spare his only son because he loved us so much that he allowed his only son to come to earth and to go through the horrible crucifixion to provide for us and provide that avenue to live in heaven. So even like David taking the lowliest jobs, Jesus took the lowliest job to show his love, and we can do the same thing, right? We try to emulate Jesus. We try to love others no matter what the task is. So starting off, it says, "The Lord is my shepherd." This is taken from David's personal experience as a shepherd in his youth. His firsthand knowledge of being a shepherd. He knows this is why he's saying these words, because he knows what it's like to be a shepherd. During that time, sheep was considered to be personal property rather than a wild animal, right? This is your prized possession. Now, a sheep is not my prized possession. But to them, that was their prized possession. That was their livelihood. That's how they lived. That's how they made their money. That's how they used the wool for clothing, right? And that was their job. That's how they was able to survive. So this sheep, even though it's personal property, it's their prized personal property. It's what they took care of. It's like having your most expensive vehicle, all right? If you've got a really nice sports car, which I don't have one, but I know someone that's got a couple, and I can tell you, if they got a sports car, they're going to take really good care of that thing. They're not going to let it get out when it's raining. They're not going to let that thing get wet. They're going to be detailing it all the time. They're going to keep battery tenders on it to keep the batteries from going down. If you've got something like that you really are going to take care of, you're going to look after it. You're going to make sure you're protected, and you're going to think about it. So David the sheep was his prized possession. It was his Maserati. It was his car that he was going to take care of. David also uses the word my in this. The Lord is my shepherd, to make it personal, right? So he's not saying, hey, the Lord is your shepherd or his shepherd or her shepherd. David is saying the Lord is my shepherd. He's my God. He is my protector. He is my being that's going to look after me. It makes it a little bit more personal, right? When you say God is your God, rather than when I say God is my God, He is my Father, that puts a different meaning on it than when you say God is your Father, right? When you take ownership of something, it puts it in a different light. So David is saying Lord is my shepherd. So David finds comfort in this because he knows what it's like to care for, provide for, to protect his sheep. Similarly, we, like David, cannot fully believe that the Lord is his shepherd if he doesn't first see himself as a sheep, and sheep are timid, defenseless, and very skittish. So another little information about sheep is, I had to look this up because, like I said, I've never had one, but they're very timid animals, right? So what that means is any sudden movements, it's like a deer on steroids, right? Now, I know about deer. And if you're in Tennessee, most of the time you know a little bit about deer. They're very, very skittish. They can smell you a mile away. They can see you. I mean, it is hard to come up on a deer unless you're driving down the road and it seems like you can hit them no problem at all. But my wife likes to poke at me because I can go deer hunting. I see all kind of squirrel and I never see a deer. I can drive down the road and they're aiming for me. So, but a sheep is very timid. They're very scared, and they very easily frightened. But they trust in that shepherd, right? So they're going to do what the shepherd asked them to do. So if we're going to truly understand what David's trying to get across here, we have to think of ourselves as a sheep as well. We have to think of ourselves as being timid, as being defenseless, because without God, we are defenseless against the devil. We are scared of evil. We are scared of dangers. And without God as our shepherd, we have no hope, right? And that's the hope we have, is when God sent Jesus. So, moving on, it says, I shall not want. The shepherd supplies all of the sheep's needs. This can be looked at in two ways, right? All of my needs are supplied by the Lord. So you think about, what do we need to live? We need food, we need clothing, we need shelter. It also says in the Bible, I think Solomon wrote, it says, and I could be wrong about that, but it reads where it states in there, why do you worry about what you're going to eat or your clothes? Does God not clothe the birds or provide food for and shelter for the animals? If God provides what the animals needs, will He not also supply what we need? His people, His creation. So similarly, David is saying this, I shall not want, because he knows God's taking care of him. God's going to supply him with what he needs. And if you look at David's life and all of the trials he went through and all of the hardships he went through, God was always right there with him, supplying him with what he needs. And if it wasn't for God, David would not have had all the victories that he did have, which were many, because we remember seeing those when we were talking about those earlier. And then also you can look at, we decide not to desire more than what is provided. We're content, right? So Jesus tells us that we're supposed to be content. We're supposed to be thankful for what we have. Similarly, David is saying, when he says, I shall not want, he knows that he's being protected, but also he knows that I don't need to ask for more than what I'm getting supplied for. I need to be happy with what I have. And if you're happy with what you have and you're trusting in God and you give Him His praises, have we not also seen, I know I have, that when you're happy and when thankful for what you have and you trust in God, God also gives you more than what you need, right? If you remember, I think it was Solomon asked, or God, or a priest, somebody asked Solomon, what do you want? And Solomon said, I want wisdom. That is what I desire. It was God speaks to him and said, I want wisdom. And God says, well, because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you wisdom. You're going to be wiser than any other king ever lived. But you're also going to get all these other things on top of it because of your heart and how your heart was. So if we are content with what we have, then God is going to not only provide with what we need, but over and above what we need. Moving on, it says, He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. A while ago, I said that sheep were very fearful and skittish. Well, in order for a shepherd to make the sheep lie down in green pastures, to make them lie down, that sheep has to trust the shepherd completely. And the picture of, David paints this picture of green pastures and still waters. Well, first of all, that's almost like a Thomas Kincaid painting, right? Green pastures, how awesome does that look? Just how peaceful that looks when you got green pastures and still waters. I can tell you right now, living on a farm, some of the prettiest sights I see is a freshly mowed hayfield. Right after we got the field out and it rains on it one time, that is the prettiest sight you'll ever see. Fresh green hayfield out there, and you got a little creek down there at the bottom. That's serendipity. Hope I said that right. My wife's not here, so I can't be told I'm wrong. So, but the green, David paints this pictures of green pastures, still waters. And the reason why he mentions the still waters is because fast-moving waters scare sheep. So it has to be still. So David's painting this picture of that he's saying, you know, he's like a shepherd, he's like a sheep laying down in green pastures and still waters. He trusts God. He has no fear and no anxiety. He is completely at peace. Moving on, it says, He restores my soul. So, as I said a while ago, I'm an insurance adjuster, okay? So I deal with houses that have had a loss to them. I went and saw one today in Dover. They had a house fire. It started in the chimney, made a little fire in the chimney, and something didn't go right. It's a total loss. Burned the complete roof off, burned the second story off. Second story fell into the first level. It's a log home, burned all the logs. I mean, it's a complete, total loss. But that's what I do. I go in and I look at these houses that had these damages, and I write how to restore the home. I used to be a general contractor that did this work. We would go into a home that has had a house fire or a pipe that has burst and flooded a home, and you can restore that home. You can bring it back to what it was the second before that event happened. Similarly, God restores our soul, right? And by doing that, He brings us back to Him. David is painting this picture of saying, God, you restore my soul. You bring my very being back to you. You restore me to pre-sin. And so David paints this beautiful picture saying, how thankful am I that even though I have sinned and I have fallen away, you bring me back. You bring me back to the herd. It's like the shepherd going and getting the sheep that has strayed, that has gone away, has wandered off, because they like to do that. And he has picked that sheep up. He has put that sheep on his shoulders and took it back with the herd. David is saying, God, that's what you do. You bring me back to your herd. Moving on. It says, it leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. God not only restores us, but He leads us in the paths according to His commandments. God is removing obstacles that hinders us. This is done for God's glory, not our own credit. So how many times have we seen, you may not see it right then. It's a lot easier, hindsight's always 20/20. It's a lot easier for us to look back on our lives and see how God has been there and what God has done for us. But if you look back on your life, you will see time and time again where God has helped you overcome these obstacles. He has taken these obstacles away from you when you've trusted in Him, right? When we've looked to God and relied on Him and put our faith in Him, God has time and time again taken those obstacles away from us so that we can be safe and we can move in the directions He wants us to go and according to His commandments and according to the way He wants us to live, because He knows what's best. He designed us. He designed this. He made this world. Moving on, it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. This is where David moves to a dark tone, right? So he's been talking about these green pastures and still waters, these beautiful pictures of how God brings us back to Him. Now he gets a little dark. It says, this is where David moves to a dark tone, right? This is when we follow the Lord, we will go through dark times. The valley is representing being hedged in on all sides, being cornered. The shadow of death represents death being in the area, but not right there with us. Death is the ultimate defeat, and to us, this is the distressing times of our life where we consider our own mortality. This can be such times as sickness, hardship, trials. So if you think of a valley, right? So the valley it's the bottom of two hills or two mountains. And you got a mountain on your right, you got a mountain on your left, you're cornered. You don't have anywhere to go. So this valley is being, okay, I'm stuck in the shadow of death, so I'm in the coattails of death, of the devil. And even though I'm not dead, the death is not right there with me, I'm in the shadow of it, right? I'm in the coattails of the ultimate defeat, and I'm hedged in on all sides. It's the picture of hopelessness. David is saying, even though I may walk through this valley, and it may be hopeless, and may be bleak, and may look like there's no out whatsoever, he moves on and says, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. We have peace because God is leading us through the valley. David states that he will not be afraid because of the trust he has in God. God is with us even in the darkest times of our lives. If you look back, and I think a lot of times, the times you can see God most is in the hard times, right? The good times, God's there in both good times and the hard times and the bad times. But the times that we see God the most, the times that we can see Him working the most, is the hard times in our lives. It's the times when we're going through some event where someone that we love is very sick. And I'm not talking about a cold. I'm talking about someone that has cancer, is going through chemo treatments or things like that, or someone who, like when the last year of my father's life, when he was in and out of the hospital with, he would get swellings because his heart was starting to fail on him. That was a dark time. That's the type of hardships, things like that. You may lose your job. You may get fired, and you're thinking, what am I going to do now? I've got a family that's relying on me. I just lost my job. The bills don't stop coming just because I don't have a job. And that's your valley. That's the valley that's the example of the valley that David is talking about here. But we fear no evil because God's with us. We know that we have this amazing belief and this amazing hope that even in the hard times, when we're on the coattails of the devil, God's right there. And we should have no fear because God has overcome the devil. And we have that hope and that trust in God that He's gonna provide for us. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So a while ago, you remember I was talking about the only thing that the shepherd really had back then to protect the sheep was the rod and the staff. So it's thought that the shepherd uses the staff to gently guide the sheep where they need to go, and they use the rod to defend the sheep. All right? So similarly, God guides us according to His commandments, and He defends us against the devil. So the staff is He's using that to gently herd the sheep, right? So when I was a kid and I would help Dad with moving the cows from one field to another, well, you would get a stick. And you wouldn't get a big stick, but you get a one that doesn't look intimidating, and you just kind of gently talk to them and lift your arms and try to herd the animals where you need to go. But the rod is going to be something different. The rod is going to be where you're going to hit something. You're going to cause harm to something as protection for your sheep. So God has His rod and staff. He uses that to protect us and to herd us where we need to go. Yes, sir.
I've heard, I'm not sure it's a definite application of a trilogy.
Hmm?
A trilogy here in Psalms. The Psalms 23 is a psalm of the cross. 22, psalm of the cross. Psalm 23 is a psalm of the crook. And Psalms 24 is a psalm of the crown. And that rod and staff, I've read that the staff has a crook, kind of like my cane.
Mm-hmm.
Crook, so the baby lamb that need to be.
Can grab it and bring it back.
Out of the brown patch or
Exactly.
whatever.
Exactly. So I know we're running out of time, so I better get through this. The next part says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." So the table there is representing a feast. So David's talking about like at a banquet, you got this big feast in front of you, and it's in the presence of your enemies. Well, if your enemy is in front of you, if you're going to eat, you're defenseless, right? Because you have to put down your weapons to eat. Well, David is saying there's this big banquet right here that you can eat, but your enemy is right there, but you can eat and not worry about it because God's right there with me. And it says, "You anoint my head with oil, my cup runneth over." The anointing the head is like showing honor to the guest, and the cup runneth over is basically saying God blesses us so much that our cup is running over. All right? "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." David is speaking to God, pursuing Him with goodness and mercy. This is beyond what he and we deserve. This in another depiction of God's immense love for us. When God is our shepherd, instead of being stalked by wild beasts or the devil, we are pursued by loving care of the Lord. then finally it says, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. God's promise for the people of Israel was not just for the promised land. God's promise is for all of his people to join him in heaven. This is the ultimate reward, the ultimate paradise, and all that inclusive. It is the all-inclusive resort that is better than Sandals or Disney World. Have nothing on. Heaven puts us even the most beautiful places on earth, such as Hawaii, to shame. So to sum up Psalm 23, it would be David telling us God's promise to love us, care for us, provide for us, defend us, prepare a place in heaven with him for eternity. What an incredible joy David and all God's people gained from this. Now, I know I went over. I'm sorry about that. I was afraid I was not going to have enough material, but I hope I was able to glean something, and hope you're able to take something back from this. I appreciate your attention, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Let me make one point.
Yes, sir.
If you look at this psalm, you'll see the first 3 verses, he talks about God.
Mm-hmm.
Starting in verse 4, he talks to God.
Yes, sir.
We shift from first person to second person. You've got the you.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting breakdown.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Yes, sir.